China just built Jamaica, the longest bridge in the country. Not a footbridge, not a pedestrian crossing. A 4-lane, 187-meter span of reinforced concrete rising 30 meters above the Montego River, built using technology that had never been deployed in the Caribbean before. The company that built it is not Jamaican, not American, not British. It is Chinese. And that bridge is one component of what has quietly become one of the most consequential infrastructure stories in the Western Hemisphere. While most people in London, New York, and Toronto are focused on Europe or the Middle East, the island many of you still carry in your chest, no matter how far you've traveled, is being physically rebuilt. Road by road, port by port, hospital by hospital, and the country doing most of that building is China. Before drawing any conclusions about what that means, it is worth understanding what is actually happening on the ground. Not the version Beijing presents, not the version Washington presents. The documented version with dollar figures, concession terms, land agreements, labor disputes, and the security hearings that have taken place inside the United States Congress. And the question that no one in authority has answered cleanly: who does this arrangement primarily benefit, and who carries the cost? In 2024 alone, China's combined portfolio of loans and grants to Jamaica totaled $409.7 million. That made China the single largest contributor of official development assistance to Jamaica that year. Not the United States, not the United Kingdom, not the Caribbean Development Bank. China by a margin that would surprise most people who still think of Jamaica as sitting comfortably within the American sphere of influence. For comparison, the United States contributed the equivalent of roughly $90 million through USAID to Jamaica in 2024, spread across 13 separate programs. Less than a quarter of what China provided. That gap did not appear overnight. It was built over 16 years of loans, concession agreements, construction contracts, and diplomatic consolidation. And understanding how it got this wide requires going back to the beginning. In November 1972, Jamaica made a diplomatic decision that most English-speaking Caribbean nations were not prepared to make. Michael Manley's newly elected government formally established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, becoming the first English-speaking Caribbean island to support the One China principle. At a time when most of the Western-aligned Caribbean was following the United States' lead, Jamaica set its own course. That decision, taken more than 50 years ago, is the foundational fact of everything that follows. For the first few decades, the relationship was functional but limited. Cultural exchanges, scholarships, small grants, the kind of steady diplomatic engagement that maintains an embassy without generating headlines. The character of the relationship began to shift in February 2009, when then Chinese Vice President Xi Jinping made an official visit to Kingston. He met with Jamaican officials. He discussed infrastructure, development financing, and what China could offer a small island nation that had been told by Western lenders to first implement painful structural adjustments before any significant money would flow. By the time he left, the groundwork had been laid for what would become the most significant foreign infrastructure relationship in Jamaican history. Two immediate outcomes followed that visit. The first was the Jamaica Development Infrastructure Program, a $340 million loan from the Export-Import Bank of China, signed in February 2010, to fund road improvements across the island. The terms were specific: 15-year maturity, 5-year grace period, 3% annual interest. The implementing contractor was China Harbor Engineering Company Czech, a state-owned enterprise that would go on to dominate Jamaican infrastructure work for the next 15 years. The second outcome was the beginning of negotiations over what would become the most contested piece of infrastructure in Jamaican history, the North-South Highway. To understand what happened with that highway, the context of Jamaica's infrastructure situation in 2010 and 2011 matters. The east-west segment of Highway 2000, connecting Kingston to the island's northern tourist corridor, had been contracted to a French company, Bouygues Travaux. Construction on the Mount Rosser leg ran into serious geotechnical problems. The terrain was worse than engineering surveys had predicted. Bouygues eventually abandoned the project. The Jamaican government had already committed approximately $120 million to that section of road. The money was spent. The highway remained unfinished. Jamaica needed a contractor willing to absorb that sunk cost, resolve the engineering failure on Mount Rosser, and complete a 66-kilometer highway connecting Caymanas in St. Catherine to Ocho Rios in St. Anne at an estimated total cost not exceeding $700 million, while the Jamaican Treasury did not have that capital available. China Harbor Engineering Company agreed to do it. The structure of that agreement was this. CHEC would build the highway, reimburse the Jamaican government for the $120 million already spent, and operate the road as a toll highway for 50 years on a build-operate-transfer basis. All toll revenue collected over that period would flow directly to CHEC. At the end of the concession, the road would revert to Jamaica at no cost. The 50-year term was already 20 years longer than comparable concessions Jamaica had granted on other public assets. But toll projections, approximately 20,000 vehicles per day on a road in a country with Jamaica's population density, could not generate adequate returns on a $700 million investment. So the Jamaican government added a second component to the deal. Land, approximately 1,200 acres of state-owned Crown land, transferred to CHEC as part of the financing arrangement. The most publicized parcel was at Mammy Bay in St. Anne, valued at $44 million by two independent Jamaican valuation firms. Additional acreage was identified at Caymanas in St. Catherine and Golden Grove in St. Anne. The justification, as articulated publicly by then opposition leader Dr. Peter Phillips, was direct. Without the land transfer, the highway would not have been financially viable for any developer. The projected traffic volumes could not support the capital requirement on their own. Phillips stated plainly, without the land deal, the highway would not have been built. The highway opened in March 2016. What followed immediately was sustained public debate about the terms. A standard car driving the full 66 kilometers currently pays $2,320 Jamaican dollars one way. Return, that is $4,640. An SUV pays $4,465 one way. A return trip to Ocho Rios costs close to 9,000 Jamaican dollars, against an average monthly wage of roughly 60,000 Jamaican dollars. Using this road regularly is not financially realistic for the majority of people who live in the communities it passes through. Scholar Javon Minto, who researched the impact of Chinese development investments on Jamaica for the Inter-American Dialogue, stated, "The locals don't drive it, and yet they are the ones paying for it. The highway sits well below its projected traffic capacity. The tolls are collected. The revenue flows to a Chinese state-owned enterprise operating under a 50-year concession agreement. What that arrangement actually represents, whether it constitutes a reasonable deal given Jamaica's fiscal constraints and infrastructure needs, or a structurally unfavorable long-term concession, is a question that Jamaican analysts, engineers, and public commentators have been debating for close to a decade. The full terms of the concession agreement are not publicly available in their complete form. The financial projections that underpin CHEC's investment case have never been disclosed. The current status of the Crown land transfers, including whether all parcels have been identified and whether any development has occurred, remains insufficiently documented in public records. The road is real. The connectivity gains are real. The concession terms, the land deal, and the accountability around both of them deserve more public scrutiny than they have received. The North-South Highway was the opening chapter of a story that has expanded considerably since 2016. By 2022, China had financed projects in Jamaica worth $2.28 billion. Accumulated investment from Chinese enterprises had exceeded $2.1 billion. The Chinese embassy in Kingston stated in June 2024 that Chinese companies have created more than 40,000 jobs in Jamaica directly. Those figures originate from Chinese official sources and have not been independently verified at the granular level, but the scale of physical construction activity is observable and documented. The company at the center of that activity is CHEC. Since entering Jamaica in 2009, it has undertaken nearly 20 major infrastructure projects across the island: airports, ports, logistics parks, water treatment facilities, roads, and now port terminal construction. In 2022, two-way trade volume between China and Jamaica reached $820 million, up 23.2% year-on-year, according to China's Ministry of Commerce. The scope of active construction in 2025 is substantial. The Southern Coastal Highway Improvement Project covers 163.5 kilometers of road, connecting Kingston to Mandeville and Bull Bay along Jamaica's southeast and coastal corridor. Financed by the Export-Import Bank of China and built by China Port Engineering Company, it was inaugurated in February 2024, the first project completed under a Chinese company following Jamaica's formal signing of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2019. As of June 2025, the project was 96% complete, with a Port Antonio bypass extension expected to continue for another 18 to 24 months. The Montego Bay Perimeter Road Project is a $274 million design-build contract awarded to Czech, covering a new 14.9-kilometer bypass around Montego Bay's central business district, road rehabilitation works on Barnett Street and West Green Avenue, the Long Hill bypass at 10.5 kilometers, and a comprehensive drainage study of the Montego Bay area. The project is one of the Jamaican government's designated top priority development initiatives. Within that project, the Montego Bay River Bridge, 187 meters long, 19.8 meters wide, 4 lanes, rising 30 meters, is, upon completion, the longest river crossing bridge in Jamaica. High-strain pile testing technology and a remote monitoring system for bridge girder launchers were applied during its construction, both used in the Caribbean for the first time. As of January 2025, the overall Perimeter Road project was 55% complete and on schedule for a mid-2026 finish. As part of the Perimeter Road project, Czech and the University of the West Indies jointly established a materials testing laboratory on site. That laboratory obtained ISO 17025 International Quality Management System certification in April 2024 and is now one of the largest engineering facilities in the Caribbean region. It is also being used to test asphalt quality for roads constructed under the SPARK program. The SPARK program, Shared Prosperity Through Accelerated Improvement to Our Road Network, carries a budget of 45 billion Jamaican dollars. It is designed to rehabilitate secondary, parochial, and community roads across the island over a 2-year period. Czech began work on 21 SPARK roads in early 2025. Over 600 community roads are set for repair under the program in 2025 and beyond. In total, across active projects at the time of this research, 163 kilometers of coastal highway nearing completion, a $274 million perimeter road and bypass system mid-construction, 600 community roads in progress, the longest bridge in Jamaican history approaching completion, all contracted to or involving Czech. That is the scale of current Chinese infrastructure activity in Jamaica. The Port of Kingston operates in a different category of strategic significance. It is the 7th largest deep-water port in the world. It sits at the intersection of the Atlantic and Caribbean shipping corridors, directly on the lanes connecting the Panama Canal to the eastern seaboard of the United States, and positioned adjacent to the Mona Passage between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, through which Atlantic-Caribbean shipping traffic moves. The port is the economic center of Jamaica's logistics ambitions and a transshipment hub for the wider Caribbean region. Since 2016, the port has operated under a 30-year concession agreement with Kingston Freeport Terminal Limited. Over $400 million was invested in the port between 2016 and 2020, covering access channel dredging, terminal reconstruction, new cranes with geopositioning technology, upgraded computer systems, and a new security framework. Cargo volumes grew by more than 60% over that period. Port employment increased by over 53%. In April 2025, Prime Minister Andrew Holness confirmed that an additional $50 million would be invested in 2025 to further upgrade equipment and expand capacity. He stated, "The Port of Kingston is now globally ranked among the top 100 ports in the world. For decades, we have spoken about Jamaica's potential to become the logistics hub of the Americas. Today, I can say with confidence, we are no longer imagining the future, we are building it." In June 2025, the Kingston Port Container Terminal Yard Phase I project was awarded to Czech, a 25-month EPC contract, marking the company's formal entry into Jamaica's port and hydraulic engineering sector. In the same month, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington published a study titled No Safe Harbor, evaluating the risk of China's port projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. The study assessed ports across the region against a structured risk index, incorporating factors including Chinese state-owned enterprise involvement, strategic geographic location, proximity to U.S. commerce, and potential for operational disruption. The Port of Kingston scored 70.7 out of 100, the highest score in the entire database. It ranked above Manzanillo and Veracruz in Mexico. The report identified Kingston as the highest-ranking port in Latin America and the Caribbean operated by a Chinese state-owned enterprise, meaning Beijing exercises a higher degree of direct operational control over Kingston than over any other major port in the region. The CSIS report stated that risks associated with Kingston extend beyond economic disruption, noting that Jamaica is a long-standing regional security partner of the United States and that the port's location at the crossroads of vital Caribbean shipping routes, including U.S. commerce transiting the Panama Canal, carries national security implications. That designation was not issued in a vacuum. It reflects a U.S. security establishment view that has been building for years. The American response to China's infrastructure presence in Jamaica has moved from diplomatic concern to formal congressional testimony. In February 2025, an expert from the Atlantic Council testified before the United States House Committee on Homeland Security on the subject of Chinese strategic port investments in the Western Hemisphere. The testimony drew on a strategy paper titled "A Strategy to Counter Malign Chinese and Russian Influence in Latin America and the Caribbean." The recommendation put to the committee was that regional government should pursue what the witness described as hard decoupling with China in areas of sensitive national security concern, including telecommunications, advanced technology, critical minerals, and critical infrastructure such as ports. In the United States Southern Command posture statement for 2025, Admiral Alvin Halsey assessed that the actions of China and Russia represent the most concerning threats in Southcom's area of responsibility. The document specifically flagged the possibility that PRC investments in the region's critical infrastructure could increase Beijing's surveillance capabilities through space facilities, telecommunication technology, and related assets. On the 7th to 9th of May 2025, Admiral Halsey visited Jamaica directly. He met with Jamaican government and defense officials for discussions on security cooperation, a visit that followed the CSIS port risk report by weeks and preceded China's announcement of new Caribbean credit lines by days. The U.S. position on China in the Caribbean is not new. In November 2019, U.S. Southcom Commander Admiral Craig Fowler was in Kingston and directly warned Jamaican officials to be wary of what he called China's campaign of disinformation in Latin America and the Caribbean. The language used in 2025 is more formally calibrated, but the underlying concern is the same. China's growing economic and infrastructure presence in a region that the United States considers strategically adjacent. What the United States has not done at any stage of this concern is match China's infrastructure investment in Jamaica dollar for dollar or project for project. The Growth in the Americas Initiative and the Build Back Better World program were both announced as U.S. alternatives to Chinese BRI investment. Their combined disbursements to Jamaica, as measured against China's $409 million 2024 development assistance total, have not been comparable. The researcher Leland Lazarus, Associate Director of National Security at Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, identified the core dynamic plainly. Most Caribbean borrower nations choose China over Western alternatives, he noted, because China offers a less time-consuming process than Western-dominated multilateral lending institutions, demands less transparency and disclosure, and supplies credit at below-market interest rates. Western lenders, he noted, are associated with the conditions of a rules-based international order that developing states find operationally burdensome. That framing is consistent with what Jamaica's own history shows. The structural adjustment programs associated with IMF and World Bank lending in the 1980s and 1990s imposed significant economic costs on Jamaican households. The memory of those conditions shapes how Jamaican policymakers and the public evaluate the relative attractiveness of Chinese financing, even financing with its own limitations and risks. The alumina dimension of this story receives limited attention in most coverage of the China-Jamaica relationship, and it is the element that most directly explains the intensity of American concern. Jamaica's bauxite deposits are among the most significant in the Western Hemisphere. Between 2019 and 2022, Jamaica supplied 64% of all bauxite imported by the United States, 64% of America's total bauxite import volume, coming from a single island of 3 million people. Over the same period, Jamaica supplied 12% of U.S. alumina imports. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, the United States imported 66,000 tons of alumina from Jamaica, a 238% year-over-year increase, as U.S. manufacturers sought to reduce dependence on alumina from Brazil and other markets affected by supply disruptions. The Heritage Foundation cited that figure in a 2025 commentary to describe Jamaica's growing importance to American industrial supply chains. Alumina is the intermediate product between raw bauxite and refined aluminium. Aluminium is an input in aerospace, automotive manufacturing, electrical systems, military equipment, and consumer goods across the American industrial economy. Jamaica's position as a supplier is not incidental. It reflects the geology of the island and decades of mining investment by American, Canadian, and, most recently, Chinese firms. The largest single alumina refinery in Jamaica is the Alpart plant, located in St. Elizabeth, with a nameplate capacity of 1.65 million tons per year. In November 2016, that plant was acquired from Russia's Rusal by China's Jiuquan Iron and Steel Company JISCO, a Chinese state-owned enterprise. JISCO announced a $3 billion expansion program at the time, targeting a capacity increase to 2 million tons per year, a $500 million LNG power plant, aluminium processing facilities, and expanded port access at Port Kaiser. Those expansion targets were not met on the announced schedule. The plant was suspended around 2019, with the stated reason being refurbishment and modernization. Its current operational status in 2025 has not been confirmed in sources available to this production. What has been confirmed is the U.S. industrial exposure. Century Aluminum, an American company, acquired a 55% stake in Jamalco, a separate Jamaican alumina operation, in April 2023, in order to secure a reliable domestic hemisphere source of alumina and alumina byproducts for the American market. Jamalco and the separately owned Windalco refinery represent significant alumina supply lines for U.S. industrial consumers. The Heritage Foundation argued in 2025 that a Chinese-built highway in Jamaica had, through poor engineering, disrupted the island's natural drainage system, affecting water management for alumina operations and creating environmental risks that could, in their assessment, threaten the supply chain for U.S. manufacturers. That argument originates from a think tank with a defined policy perspective and represents one analytical view of the situation rather than an established technical finding. It is cited here as part of the documented record of U.S. concern, not as a verified engineering assessment. The documented structural reality is this: Jamaica's bauxite and aluminum industry supplies a significant proportion of American critical materials imports. The largest refinery on the island is now Chinese-owned. The roads around it are being built by a Chinese state-owned contractor, and the port through which alumina shipments move has been designated the highest-risk Chinese infrastructure project in the hemisphere by a leading U.S. security think tank. That convergence: Chinese ownership in mining, Chinese construction in transport, Chinese contracting in ports across a single island that supplies the majority of U.S. bauxite imports, is what generates the alarm in Washington. Whether that alarm is proportionate is a separate question. The factual basis for it is straightforward. The Western Children and Adolescent Hospital in Montego Bay represents a different dimension of the China-Jamaica relationship, one that is harder to frame through a geopolitical lens because its purpose is unambiguously medical. The agreement to build the hospital was signed in October 2017 between Health Minister Christopher Tufton and Chinese Ambassador Niu Qingbao. China committed more than 300 million Chinese yuan, approximately 5.8 billion Jamaican dollars at the time, as grant funding toward the facility's construction. The grant was supplemented by Jamaican government co-funding. The facility is being built on the compound of the Cornwall Regional Hospital in St. James. When complete, it will have a 220-bed capacity across 6 stories, with an in-house pharmacy, emergency room, dialysis room, food court, staff accommodation, and administrative offices. It is designed to provide specialized pediatric and adolescent care for children up to 18 years of age across all of Western Jamaica. Jamaica has had one dedicated children's hospital for the entirety of its post-independence history, the Bustamante Hospital for Children in Kingston, established in 1962. For families in Montego Bay, Negril, Savannah, Lamar, and the wider western parishes, accessing specialist pediatric care has required travel to Kingston, a journey that, depending on origin, takes multiple hours and imposes transport and accommodation costs on families already managing a medical emergency. Construction under the project commenced in 2017. By the end of December 2024, phases I and II were complete. Structural works for the main building, nurses' residence, morgue, and underground water tanks had been finished. The sewerage system had been upgraded. In the 2025-2026 estimates of expenditure tabled before the Jamaican House of Representatives, 800 million Jamaican dollars was allocated to complete the building's exterior cladding and procure medical equipment. The project encountered a disruption in September 2025. Chinese workers at the construction site withdrew their services, citing payment concerns. Health Minister Tufton confirmed publicly that the government had concerns about the pace of work and the potential impact of the labor stoppage on the project's completion schedule. As of October 2025, dialogue was ongoing and the government had received assurances that work would continue. The hospital, when it opens, will be the first dedicated children's hospital in the English-speaking Caribbean. That is not a promotional description. It is a straightforward statement of regional healthcare infrastructure. The facility represents a genuine gap being filled, funded in part by Chinese grant money. In a country where Chinese investment is simultaneously the subject of significant strategic controversy, the phrase debt-trap diplomacy has been applied frequently to Chinese infrastructure lending in the developing world. The argument holds that China deliberately extends financing to countries it expects will default, then uses the resulting debt leverage to extract strategic concessions, typically in the form of asset control or preferential access. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, leased to a Chinese company for 99 years following debt difficulties, is most often cited as the reference case. Applied to Jamaica, the debt trap argument does not align with the documented numbers. Chinese loans account for approximately 3.9% of Jamaica's total loan portfolio. That is not a level of exposure that would characterize a country structurally dependent on Chinese credit or at risk of Chinese-engineered default. The Jamaican government has stated explicitly that it will not take on further Chinese loan financing. Future infrastructure projects with Chinese involvement are to be structured as joint ventures, public-private partnerships, or private sector commercial transactions. That policy position was articulated as part of Jamaica's broader commitment to reducing its overall debt burden, and it reflects the government's own assessment of the appropriate limits of the relationship. Analysts examining the broader Caribbean BRI context have noted that China has demonstrated a consistent pattern of loan renegotiation with small island developing states when repayment becomes difficult, a pattern inconsistent with the debt-for-asset extraction model the debt trap narrative describes. None of this means that every aspect of Jamaica's infrastructure agreements with China has been structured optimally. The 50-year concession on the North-South Highway, 20 years longer than comparable Jamaican concessions, is a documented structural anomaly. The transfer of over 1,000 acres of Crown land to a Chinese state-owned enterprise, on terms that have not been fully disclosed to the public, is a legitimate governance concern. The toll rates that price most Jamaicans off a highway whose construction was financed by Jamaican debt obligations reflect a deal structure that prioritized developer return over public access. These are not debt trap dynamics in the technical sense. They are negotiating outcomes that reflect the relative leverage of a small island nation in fiscal difficulty seeking infrastructure financing against a state-owned enterprise with access to Chinese state banking. Whether Jamaica extracted the best available terms under those conditions is a question that cannot be answered without full transparency over the concession documents that remain largely unavailable to the public. The Belt and Road Initiative provides the formal framework within which Jamaica's infrastructure relationship with China now operates. Jamaica formally joined the BRI in 2019, becoming, according to Chinese official sources, the first country in the Western Hemisphere to sign a specific BRI cooperation plan. 10 Caribbean nations are now BRI signatories, Grenada, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname and Cuba. For Washington, that list represents a significant pattern of Chinese diplomatic and economic consolidation in a region that American strategic planning has historically treated as a near-abroad sphere of influence. The BRI in the Caribbean is not primarily a development program from the U.S. perspective. It is, as Southcom and congressional testimony have framed it, a mechanism for extending Chinese economic leverage and, potentially, surveillance or military-adjacent access into strategically proximate territory. The Taiwan dimension is also documented in the public record. China's diplomatic objective across the Caribbean includes the progressive reduction of international support for Taiwan. Every Caribbean BRI signatory recognizes the People's Republic rather than the Republic of China. Jamaica has maintained that position since 1972. The deepening of economic ties through infrastructure investment makes any future reconsideration of that position politically and economically less viable. That is a strategic outcome China is deliberately pursuing, and the BRI is one of the instruments through which it does so. In May 2025, at the China CELAC Forum in Beijing, President Xi Jinping announced $9.2 billion in new credit for Latin American and Caribbean nations. The summit also saw Colombia formally join the BRI. China simultaneously pledged $20 billion for regional infrastructure, $10 billion in concessional loans, and a $5 billion cooperation fund. The United States response, occurring in the same weeks, took a different form. Admiral Halsey's visit to Kingston for security discussions. Exercise Trade Winds 25 with American Special Operations Forces operating across Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua, Martinique, and Puerto Rico. Congressional testimony on Chinese port risk. A formal CSIS security index designating Kingston as the hemisphere's highest-risk Chinese port. Both powers were active in the Caribbean in May 2025. China was announcing financing commitments measured in billions. The United States was conducting security exercises and publishing risk assessments. The contrast reflects a fundamental asymmetry in the instruments each country is currently deploying in the region. The labor question in Jamaica's Chinese infrastructure projects has generated documented public dispute over several years and deserves direct treatment. Caribbean trade unions have formally objected to what they describe as unfair competitive advantages enjoyed by Chinese contracting firms on Jamaican projects, including customs duty exemptions and reduced safety compliance costs that, in the union's assessment, undercut local market competition. In Jamaica specifically, protests have occurred over wage irregularities and the employment of a disproportionate number of Chinese workers in roles that Jamaican workers and professionals could fill. Civil engineer Carvel Stewart, former president of the Incorporated Master Builders Association of Jamaica, stated publicly that Chinese firms on Jamaican projects do not engage Jamaican engineers or managers, only Jamaican labor. He described this as short-sightedness and identified it as a structural failure to develop the Jamaican construction management sector. Checks stated employment targets for the Montego Bay Perimeter Road project: 90% Jamaican unskilled workers, 50% Jamaican technicians represent a documented commitment to local workforce inclusion. The company reports that more than 1,000 local residents have been employed on that project, and that hundreds have received skills certification in road construction and laboratory testing. Prime Minister Holness, during a site visit to the Perimeter Road in 2022, specifically praised the integration of the local labor force into the construction work, while acknowledging the broader challenge of balancing major arterial infrastructure with community road investment. The Western Children and Adolescent Hospital dispute in September 2025, in which Chinese workers stopped work over unpaid wages, adds a different dimension. Not a dispute between Jamaican and Chinese workers over job allocation, but a dispute between Chinese workers and the contracting arrangement over payment terms. Both types of labor friction have occurred on Chinese contracted projects in Jamaica, and both are part of the documented record. There are important facts about the Jamaica-China infrastructure relationship that the public record does not fully resolve. The complete terms of the North-South Highway Concession Agreement are not publicly available. The current development status of the Crown land transferred to Czech, over 1,000 acres, has not been documented in accessible public records. The financial projections and revenue figures underlying Czech's toll road operation have never been disclosed. The current operational status of JISCO's alumina plant in 2025 has not been confirmed in verified sources. The full project timeline and opening date for the Western Children and Adolescent Hospital has not been established, given the September 2025 labor disruption. These gaps are not speculative concerns. They are documented absences in the public accounting of agreements made in the name of the Jamaican people, using Jamaican public land, public credit, and public port infrastructure. For the Jamaican diaspora, approximately 2 million people living in the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and across the Caribbean, the practical meaning of these infrastructure developments is both immediate and long-term. Immediate, because the roads being built, the port being expanded, and the hospital under construction directly affect the quality of life of family members still on the island. A better coastal highway reduces travel time to medical appointments. A Montego Bay bypass reduces congestion for workers, businesses, and tourists in the island's second city. A children's hospital in Western Jamaica eliminates the need for families to travel to Kingston for specialist pediatric care. Long-term, because the concession agreements underpinning these projects run for decades. The North-South Highway concession extends to approximately 2066. The 30-year Kingston Freeport Terminal concession runs beyond 2046. The Crown land transfers to Czech have no fixed return date in public documentation. The infrastructure being built today under Chinese financing and contracting terms will still be operating under those terms long after the political figures who signed the agreements have left office. The diaspora has a documented stake in Jamaica's economic development. Remittances from Jamaicans abroad represent a significant component of the island's household income and foreign exchange receipts. The economic productivity of Jamaica, its capacity to grow, to employ its people, to reduce the conditions that drive emigration, is shaped in part by whether its infrastructure investment decisions produce long-term national benefit or long-term concession obligations that constrain future policy choices. The Jamaican government's stated position is that the China relationship represents sovereign development choice, not dependence. Prime Minister Holness has argued publicly that Jamaica is not choosing China over the United States. Jamaica is choosing development on terms it can access, while maintaining relationships with multiple international partners. The 30-year Kingston Freeport Terminal concession is with CMA CGM, a French company. Century Aluminum, an American firm, holds a 55% stake in Jamaica. The Caribbean Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the European Union, and the World Bank all remain active development partners. The BRI signing was, in Holness's framing, a practical instrument for accessing Chinese infrastructure financing, not an ideological alignment with Beijing. That framing has internal logic. Jamaica is not in a position to refuse infrastructure investment and wait for Western alternatives to arrive on better terms. The infrastructure deficit is documented and acute. The fiscal constraints that limit Jamaican borrowing are real. And the history of conditionality attached to Western development financing has produced skepticism within Jamaica's political class that is not without basis. The question the framing does not answer is whether, given those constraints, the specific terms negotiated in each agreement represented the best available outcome. The 50-year highway concession, the land transfers, the toll structure, the opacity of concession documents. These are distinct from the policy question of whether to engage with China. At all, they are questions about the quality of negotiation and the adequacy of public accountability for the terms reached. Both the Chinese ambassador to Jamaica and senior Jamaican government officials have described the bilateral relationship in positive terms. Chinese officials have cited over 40,000 jobs created and more than $2 billion invested. Jamaican officials have cited road completion, port growth, and hospital construction as concrete improvements in national infrastructure. Those are documented outcomes. The documented concerns concession terms, land transfers, labor disputes, toll affordability, and the U.S. security designation of Kingston Harbor are equally part of the record. A complete account of the China-Jamaica infrastructure relationship requires both. In the 52 years since Jamaica established diplomatic relations with China, the relationship has moved from symbolic recognition to the most significant bilateral infrastructure partnership in Jamaican history. China built the longest bridge in Jamaica. It is completing the largest road project in the country's history. It is entering the port sector of the seventh largest deep-water port in the world. It holds ownership of the largest alumina refinery on the island. It is building the first dedicated children's hospital in the English-speaking Caribbean. And it is repairing 600 community roads across the parishes where most Jamaicans live. That is a documented and substantial physical footprint. Against it sits a set of unresolved questions about the governance of the relationship, the terms of concession agreements not available to the public, the Crown land whose current development status is undocumented, the toll structure that excludes most Jamaicans from infrastructure financed through Jamaican debt obligations, and the port whose operational involvement by a Chinese state-owned enterprise has been formally designated the highest security risk of any Chinese-linked port in Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States has responded with congressional testimony, Southcom visits, security exercises, and risk assessments. It has not responded with comparable infrastructure investment. China has responded by announcing $0.9 billion in new Caribbean and Latin American credit lines, signing Colombia into the BRI, and awarding Czech a new contract in Kingston Harbor. The trajectory of the relationship is toward deepening, not reduction. The infrastructure already built is not going to be removed. The concessions already signed are not going to be renegotiated on the basis of think tank risk indices. The Western Children and Adolescent Hospital is going to open, and when it does, children across Western Jamaica will receive specialist care without traveling to Kingston. Those outcomes are real. What the next chapter of this relationship produces, whether it strengthens Jamaican institutional capacity, builds Jamaican engineering and management expertise, generates sustainable port revenue that accrues to the Jamaican economy, and results in infrastructure whose long-term terms serve the Jamaican public interest, will be determined by the quality of oversight, negotiation, and accountability that Jamaican institutions bring to bear on agreements that are, in several cases, already signed. The bridge is standing. The highway is paved. The hospital is rising. The question is not whether China is building in Jamaica. The record is clear on that. The question is what Jamaica is building in return, not in concrete, but in institutional capacity, in governance, in the public accountability of the agreements made on its behalf. That is the question the next 50 years will answer.